Welcome everyone to our conference on World Heritage, Gender and Sustainable Development. So we're going to start with the opening remarks with Novagorica, introduced by Macroarchi. Macroarchi is an Italian conservation architect, presently lecturer and researcher at the University of Novagorica Program of Cultural Heritage Studies. Is interested in cultural and natural heritage preservation, including cultural and historic urban landscape management.
Hello, everyone. So thank you very much, Mrs. Uttering, for the presentation. So dear attendees, panelists, colleagues, and friends, I would like to welcome you all to this final event, the conference of the session on diversities and gender that has been organized during the month of March 2021 within the global initiative of our World Heritage. The University of Novagorica, the fourth and youngest Slovenian university, was established in 1995 as a polytechnic with a specialization on environmental issues, becoming then a university in 2005. That same year was the year of the launch of the doctoral program in economics and techniques for the conservation of the architectural and environmental heritage, today cultural heritage studies, that was jointly established with the University UF in Venice, and as is the background for our commitment in this worldwide initiative. Nevertheless, we also manage UNESCO with the UNESCO chair in Ljubljana for open education, a program, the Open Education for a Better World, that is meant to spread education and contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, and has a lot to share with this initiative. This conference is an initiative in general, in specific, I would say, this session on diversities and gender and diversities has a special meaning also for the area of the University of Novagorica, which is the urban agglomerate of Gorizia and Novagorica. We are on the border between Italy and Slovenia, which is an area that has been going through very difficult moments, especially along the 20th century with the two world wars, and is by definition, I would say, one of the most interesting areas of coexistence of different ethnicities and diversities from different perspectives, I would say. As you may know, this event was anticipated by 4 webinars that have been focusing on different topics, namely marginalization and minoritization, domination, discrimination, exclusion, and erasure, held on the 3rd of March. Then colonial legacies of gender and sexuality, held on the 10th of March. Local learning, everyday activism, everyday resistances, what can I do? Held on the 15th of March, and institutional inequalities, unequal power relations, held on the 23rd of March, last Tuesday. These webinars have already told us much about the need to have a broader debate on the impacts and effects of the World Heritage List worldwide, showing that there is a huge interest to contribute to the list itself, as well as to the preservation of cultural and natural heritage in its multifaceted aspects. The conference of today will be, today and tomorrow is organized in 4 different panels. In the morning, the panel will be on monuments of oppression. In the afternoon, we will be a panel on oppression from monuments. Tomorrow morning, the panel will be concentrating on intangible heritage as part of future heritage past. And then the last panel will be on SDGs within spaces and places of heritage. Few practical information. So the spoken language will be English mostly. There will be captions provided through an automatic tool of Zoom. So we expect it's quite a good captioning, and you can see clicking on the CC icon below your Zoom. The webinar is recorded and live streamed on YouTube on this link. If you want to pose any question to the panelists, you can use the Q&A box below, not the chat. And then, of course, a small, it's important to underline that we want this experience be positive and productive for all of us. So we don't tolerate harassment or any kind of pushing in any form. That's all I would say. Practically, we also have some, of course, appearances in the social medias. You probably are aware of that, so feel free to use them as much as you want along the conference and after. So thank you very much, and I give the floor again to Mrs. Utterin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marco, for your opening remark. So we're going to move forward with the opening ancestral prayers by Ade Williams. So Ade Williams is a culture and heritage consultant. Ade shares his expertise about Yoruba philosophy, language, and spirituality with the Black diaspora through lectures, collaboration, and bespoke consultancy services. Welcome, Ade.
Thank you very much. So, Agbára Elédùmarè, Mojúbà o. Mojúbà Elédùmarè. Mojúbà Akọ́dá ayé, Mojúbà Aṣẹ̀dá ayé o. Mojúbà ẹni tó dá ayé òun ọ̀run. Orísun ayé òun ọ̀run. Ọba òyígíyigì. Ọba Èkó. Ìbà Elédùmarè o. Ìbà Ẹlẹ́dàá gbogbo àwọn àtàwọn ń pàdé yìí lẹ́yìn. Kí Elédùmarè ṣàánú gbogbo wa. Ire gbogbo tí oníkálùkù wa ń fẹ́ kó tó wà lọ́wọ́. Mojúbà alẹ́ ayé, mojúbà òde ọ̀run. Mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin òjíṣẹ́ Elédùmarè o. Mojúbà orígun mẹ́rẹ̀ẹ̀rin ilé ayé, mojúbà òkè ayé, mojúbà odò ayé o. Mojúbà ọ̀tún, mojúbà òsì, mojúbà wa, mojúbà ẹ̀yin o. Mojúbà ààyè láàrin, mojúbà gbogbo egungun ayé, gbogbo òkú ọ̀run. Mojúbà ẹ̀yin aláyé, mojúbà ẹ̀yin aláyẹ̀, mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin aláṣẹ. Mojúbà ẹ̀yin àgbà tí gbani lọ́jọ́ gbogbo. Mojúbà ẹ̀yin ìyá wa mẹ́tẹ̀ẹ̀ta. Mojúbà ẹ̀yin irúnmọlẹ̀, mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin irúnmọlẹ̀. Mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin òrìṣà. Mojúbà Ọbàtálá, mojúbà Èṣù, mojúbà Ògún, mojúbà Ṣàngó, mojúbà Yemọja, mojúbà Ọ̀ṣun, mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin alálẹ̀, mojúbà ìyá mi omi o, mojúbà Òsàrà, mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin ẹlẹgbẹ́, mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin Elémèrè o, mojúbà ẹ̀yin ìyá mẹ́tẹ̀ẹ̀ta. Ìtawà wa ṣe lé ní nípa diversity and gender kó lọ sí re o. Gbogbo àwọn tá a sì wá ṣe fún ìwọ Ọbàtálá, ìwọ ló dá gbogbo ayé o, ìwọ ló dá èèyàn. Gbogbo àwọn ọmọ rẹ náà ń ṣe kó wá dáàbò bò wọn, kó mú ìtọ́jú rẹ, kó mú wá bá gbogbo wọn báyìí. Nǹkan kan má ṣe gbogbo àwọn ọmọ rẹ o. Ìwọ onílẹ̀, ìyá mi ọ̀gẹ́rẹ́, Afọkọ́yẹrí, alákùnrin tọmọ aráyé ń pèlè alápòkà, ìbárẹ́lì ni wọn. Mojúbà gbogbo ẹ̀yin òrìṣà o, mojúbà ẹ̀yin ọlọ́jọ́ èmi o. Ìní ọjọ́ ajé, gbogbo àwọn táwa ń pàdé yìí, kájé má wá wá sí o. Ibikíbi tá a bá wà báyìí, kájé wá wá rí. Ohunkóhun tá a bá sì gbọ́ lédè láti ní ìlọ, ire ni kó jẹ́ fún gbogbo bẹ́ẹ̀ ni kó rí o. So I wish everybody good luck and prosperity on this very occasion, and it's going to go very, very well and so smoothly. You guys won't even believe it. In the name of God, Olódùmarè, Àṣẹ. Thank you.
Thank you, Ade, for this amazing prayer. And I hope everyone, enjoyed this prayer. So now I'm going to introduce the session with our amazing speaker. So we have at least 5 speakers today who will share their expertise and share their point of view. So our first speaker will be Adaku Ezugdu, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant from Ireland. The second speaker will be Shahid Wada, Arki Mefeche, Chair, Critical and Decolonial Humanities Professor from the University of Cape Town from South Africa. Our third speaker will be Elena Settimini, Heritage and Museum Consultant from Italy. And our fourth speaker will be from Common Ground. Common Ground is a movement that set out to examine Oxford colonial past in the context of its present-day inequalities. And our last speaker from Road Must Fall, a movement to decolonize the space, curriculum, and the institutional memory at and to fight international oppression within Oxford. So let's start with our first speaker, Adeku Ezudu. Welcome, Adeku.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So let's get started. Good morning from Ireland, and I'll be talking about monuments of oppression and the question around, what ways the monuments are oppressive and what are the solutions to what becomes of these monuments. So I'll just get started, right?
Yes.
Okay, great stuff. So it is worth considering, why do monuments even exist in the first place? Do they really matter? And certainly when you think about it, they do, because monuments can contribute to a sense of shared heritage in societies where, they reflect their values and understanding of the past. But if these monuments are oppressive or offensive and represent people who fought to preserve slavery, or people who paid homage to hate or injustice or exploitation and oppression rather than heritage, then they should not be existing in public spaces and must be removed. And when we think about monuments such as statues, they resonate as symbols of power, and that which must be eulogized. It's a constant reminder of what and who must be ingrained in our memories. So the function of statues really is not just to remember a name, but it's also to remember an action. So for me, I imagine, imagine being constantly reminded of the actions of colonialists who shaped the racism hell many people of color are facing today. Imagine how I feel as a West African person walking past a statue of the likes of Edward Colton, who I know made some of his fortune from slave trade. Through his company, according to research, Colston transported an estimated 84,000 slaves from West Africa to the Americas, and tens of thousands of slaves died even before they reached the American shores. And I also would like us to imagine what it means for Black people and people of color who may be on their way to work or even to school run, having to walk past the statues of the likes of Cecil Rhodes, another British colonialist who referred to the British as the finest race in the world, and actually urged them to rehabilitate the most despicable of human beings, again referring to the Black people, by bringing them under the British dominion. Unfortunately, those words are still haunting Black people to today, because we continue to be treated as less than human. Black lives are paid less, they're provided with less opportunity, are jailed more, and die in greater numbers through austerity and marginalization. And when I bring it home to Ireland, where I live, one of Dublin's landmark hotels removed 4 statues from the entrance to their property. This was last year. The hotel is called the Shelbourne, and it's situated in the city center. So the statues were erected about 153 years ago. And 2 of the statues depict slave girls holding torches with manacles around their feet, and the other 2 depict Nubian princesses. But again, these are images and statues that celebrate oppression. Why should it be there? How do you think people that have faced these oppressions, even to today, feel when they walk past and see those things? So all of those statues were removed, thankfully, last year by this hotel in solidarity with the worldwide movement against racism. So what point am I trying to make here? That removal of statues that glorify figures whose reputation and fortunes were built on the crushing of people of color and the stifling of indigenous cultures is paramount. Every statue torn down is a strike against the layers of injustice that are present in everyday experiences of some people. They offer nothing than the legitimization of the past and current oppression. The function they serve is not for the historical purpose, but for the retention of hierarchy and class. So the presence of the likes of Rose and Colston's statue from the examples I gave is a continual rewriting of history. It is a symbol of patriarchal figures, who bestowed a prestigious scholarship to a selected few, obscuring really the true sources of their wealth. So how do we, what are the solutions around this? When we see, monuments of oppression, how can we, manage this kind of incidences? So I think that rather than polluting the air with monuments to the perpetrators of pain, efforts should be made to preserve instead the memorials that honor the fortitude of the victims. No statues of tyrants should be anywhere near public spaces. Spaces and symbols of oppression should be torn down while creating spaces for all of the stories and lives that have been obliterated in the name of empire and capital. And for architects and artists, it's so important to vet the history of the premises you wish to design upon or to build on, and commit to clean art, art without racist undertones and imageries. It's also important to consider diversity, equity, and inclusion in decision making when designing social spaces, to ensure that they are safe spaces for all. And when I mean safe spaces, I mean no one should feel offended by a design. No one should feel intimidated, or nobody's story should be whitewashed, excluded through a design. So going back to, Colson, something, when I watched a YouTube video of how they toppled the statue into the Bristol harbor where his slave ships were, once docked. I thought it was a time, it was a significant moment in history where the power and narrative were given back to the oppressed. They had the moment to express their self and express their anger, and the experience of racism. I also think it was a moment, or that it should be a moment of a wider reckoning about racism, and true solidarity, with this kind of a movement in a country like Ireland and throughout the world would be around, pulling down racist institutions.
Thank you, Adeku, for your interesting point of view. And now we're going to go to the next speaker, and I have to remind you, so we are talking about the monuments of oppression, which is our first session, and our next speaker is Shawid Wada, Archimephichid Chair, Critical and Decolonial Humanities Professor from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Welcome, Shahid.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for inviting me to present at this conference. I think that the initiatives that have been taken thus far have been very, very welcome. And on a world scale, it's encouraging a massive debate. And thank you, Adaku Izedu, for mentioning the way in which monuments, statues in particular, are oppressive. So part of what I was going to say, I don't have to repeat. And so perhaps I shall just begin by saying that given what was just been said, monuments of oppression hardly need to be debated today. They exist, and I guess some of the debate should be around what to do with them. Removal of them is one way of doing it. In a recent book on contested history, there's a range of options that were proposed. But in any event, what I want to say is that while there have been clearly statues like Colston, like the Rhodes statue, the Confederate statues in the United States are clearly monuments of oppression. There are others, such as Fort Jesus in Mombasa in Kenya, which have a very rich, layered history. They've been occupied by the Portuguese, by various Swahili sultans, by the British, and is now a World Heritage Site. So some of these are very much more complicated, and we need to take notice of those. But I want to make another, or rather three other critical points, and that especially in the way in which World Heritage conventions and national states policies and legislations operate. So the first point I want to make is that which was hinted at in the first talk, was that governments usually messages are popping up on my screen. I don't know why. Usually operate on the basis that it must be inclusive, and that this and they tend to project a one story that fits for everybody. This tends to be homogeneous, and it may not be the case, as we've already learned. One of the outcomes of this is that people talk about respect for diversity, and that we must have all the different stories that surround the statues or the monuments being told. And they largely couch this in a phrase called respect for diversity. I just want to alert us to that. When we respect for diversity is one thing, but while we respect diversity, we must be careful not to reinscribe or reassert old prejudices. So diversity and differences are important, but we must understand also that some of these differences might reinscribe oppression, prejudice. And so, for example, what I mean by this is that what we have is a colonial legacy that largely imports Eurocentric ideas into the kinds of statues, the kinds of monuments we have. And this takes the form, also in the form of museums, what kind of music we must listen to, what constitutes high art, and so on. And these hide what we've already learned, the struggle that has been against colonial theft, plantation slavery, wars of liberation, gender discrimination, and so on. So we have to be careful about not erasing what has happened. The second one is that one of the things that has happened over the last 50 years or more, 70 years, 80 years or more since the Second World War has been that the notion of democracy has been promulgated as the model for all societies. While I don't have a problem with democracy, we also have to be careful about how we understand this democracy. Many commentators have commented that some of the ways in which we practice democracy reinscribe the old slave social contract or racial contract, and that this gets extended when we talk about it in terms of when we equate neoliberalism with democracy. And what it does then is to erase the idea of slavery, of indentured labor, of ethnicized tribal affiliations, and segregation that goes with it. So one just needs to be careful about how this happens. So for example, here in South Africa, at the Houses of Parliament, you have both a statue of Nelson Mandela, but you still have the statue of the first all-white parliament that was created way back in 1910. And what this does not, well, one can ask questions about it, but usually what happens is that there's hardly any questioning around it, because what happens is simply that you add new statues and new monuments, but you don't question the old monuments. And this is critical in going forward with heritage into the future. So we have to understand how this works, and it must be open to public critique as to whether one monument that stands for democracy and freedom and one monument which stands for oppression and racial discrimination, whether having two of these kinds of statues actually helps. I'll leave that point over there. The last point that I want to make is that, and this arises out of my previous point, is that how do we address what I call the colonial imprint in many of our countries, particularly in the cities. And this applies both across former colonial powers as well as in the post-colonies. Particularly since many of the traces of indigenous people have been obliterated. And what is held up as most important is how we are modern. And the modern is usually defined in particular ways which do not encompass the cultures, the histories, the economies of formerly colonized people. What I'm arguing for here is that when we think of how to make these changes, we need to reflect and think about what kinds of artifacts, what kinds of statues, how do they articulate with disparities and inequalities of wealth, of poverty and power, and to ask our questions about how the meanings of those statues are shaped. What do they say? What don't they say? And currently, it is my view that many of the statues and the monuments that currently exist from the colonial era into the post-colonial era have still not been addressed in ways that highlight not only the oppressive conditions under which they were erected, but continue the current forms of racial discrimination and prejudice. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So welcome, Elena. So
thank you.
You can share your point of view as well, and talk about, what you think, your expertise about the monument of oppression as well.
Yes, thank you very much. So in the last few days, I've been thinking a lot about how to discuss today's topic, and I decided to engage with the concept of oppression from a female perspective on cultural landscapes. More specifically, I would like to share a part of my PhD research on interpretation, representation, and management of cultural landscapes. My research particularly focused on understanding how people articulate their heritage and identity values, and whether their identification and interpretation of such values could be negotiated with academic knowledge. In other words, how individual and collective participation could be fostered in order to challenge and maybe counteract hierarchical and power dynamics within heritage management. So today, I would like to reflect on how a cultural landscape, that is a landscape made of monuments, museums, public spaces, as well as cultural practices and policies, could shape and support a narrative which is oppressive of some groups. In 2017, I conducted a fieldwork in an Italian World Heritage cultural landscape, the vineyard landscape of Langhe, Roero, and Monferrato, which is a region in northwestern Italy. The first step of this research has been to explore how legal documents articulate heritage values, and I specifically analyzed the executive summary of this site, which is an important document that includes essential information extracted from the main text of the nomination. What emerged from these analyses is a wide use of male-oriented discourse, which celebrates the relationship between the man and the landscape. Unfortunately, such discourse is reiterated throughout the document. Thus, the spontaneous questions we should raise are, where are the women? Which role do they play in the construction of heritage and identity values of this landscape? I didn't mention it before, but I chose this landscape as this is the region where my family comes from. So I grew up listening to the fascinating memories of my grandparents' youth in the countryside, and I heard stories about strong and fierce women. So I started looking for these women in the landscape, and I realized that their stories are invisible. While you can find monuments dedicated to the work of men in the vineyards, you will not find a single one celebrating the role of women. And the same masculine biais can be found in museums dedicated to the wine culture of this region. An example of such ambiguous representation is given by the Marchioness Juliet Colbert, the only historical female character mentioned in the executive summary for her merits in the improvement of the wine production. Unexpectedly for the society of the 19th century, Juliet was able to enter a world dominated by men and to gain their trust. At the time, the highest positions of this sector were open only to men, as expertise and professional training were not accessible to women. Even from a cultural perspective, drinking wine, especially in public, was not considered a proper activity for women. Despite having affirmed the key role played by Juliet, the executive summary doesn't mention her in the long list of famous entrepreneurs and enologists. This ambiguous interpretation and reticence to celebrate her as a woman engaged in wine development is not limited to the executive summary, but it is evident also in the wine museum hosted in her family castle. The narration of the museum is developed around the story of wine, with an exhibition dedicated to Juliet, revealingly her contribution to the development of innovative wine production practices is marginalized, leaving many open questions. Did she merely use a male approach, or did her cultural background and gender identity emerge in the management of the vineyard? More relevance is given to her role as benefactress, recreating the traditional gendered roles which understand aristocratic women as properly engaged in charitable activities. Nevertheless, her belonging to the aristocracy guaranteed a certain visibility and the possibility to play a part in the creation of local cultural heritage. In contrast, women workers belonging to lower classes are excluded from the mainstream narrative of the vineyard landscape. This lack of representation opens another level of discrimination within the generic group of women determined by class. Juliet could find a place in the mainstream narrative because of her aristocratic background, while working class women's stories have been omitted. Unfortunately, I realized that this lack of representation is not perceived as an issue. For example, the ICOMOS advisory body evaluation provided a series of indications and recommendations, but there is no mention of the evident gap in the inclusion of different cultural perspectives, and no reference to gender misinterpretation or misrepresentation within the site. The question raised is whether this unbalanced representation within cultural documents and institutions mirrors a more widely spread sociocultural and economic exclusion. And I could somehow answer to this question after reading a recent report by the nonprofit National Association Women of Wine. Actually, in 2016, the association conducted a national survey concerning the condition of women working in the enological sector in order to understand the level of gender equality achieved. Despite the data collected evidenced some sociocultural improvements, it also revealed some unexpected situations, such as a level of sexism that was higher than expected. In the case study I presented, oppression is somehow in a gray zone, as it is not so explicit, and I was able to detect it because of my direct experience with the women of my family, but also because I sought to listen to the stories of people living and working in the landscape. So in my case,
thank you. Forward, and we're gonna have also the time to discuss more with all the speakers in our discussion. So our next speakers are the representative of Common Ground and Road Must Fall. So we're gonna introduce you, Olivier Duval and Jess Dunmer.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to turn my video off just so my microphone is better.
Hi, I just want to say first, thank you for inviting Common Ground to this fascinating discussion. It's been really thought-provoking listening to the other speakers and their work, examining some of the issues around kind of preserving and sharing cultural heritage, especially in the context of kind of gender and empire. So I'm Jess. I'm an undergraduate studying English literature at Pembroke College, Oxford. And I just wanted to give a quick overview of Common Ground, and then I'll pass over to Liv, who will kind of talk about some of our recent work. So Common Ground developed after the initial Roads Must Fall movement in Oxford in 2015. And we are a student-led decolonising collective that seeks to examine Oxford's colonial past through the lens of kind of present-day inequalities of racism, sexism, classism, for example. And we work alongside kind of community activists, academics and other liberation campaigns to lobby the university on its anti-racism and decolonising commitments. And we also kind of organise panel discussions, symposiums, and kind of protest events, although obviously kind of COVID has somewhat limited those. And I was just going to pass over now to Liv to talk about some of our recent work this year.
Brilliant, thank you, Jess. Yeah, just to echo what Jess has said, thank you so much for letting us speak. I feel very inspired being able to hear everyone who's already spoken. In the last year, in June 2020, Common Ground released an open letter tackling the issue of Oxford and anti-racism. Later that year, in November, we issued a response to All Souls' statement referring to their Codrington statue, Christopher Codrington, being a slave owner from the late 17th century. A statue of him stands in the centre of the library in All Souls College in Oxford. We also then released a response yeah, so sorry, we released a response to their statement in which they denied the importance of the statue in their library, and we asked the university and the college to further their efforts to decolonize the heritage space within their college. We've also held a number of panel discussions, one on decolonizing academia in the November 2020 alongside the Christian Coal Society. And we've also spoken on a panel discussion with Oxford Anti-Racist City in October 2020 as part of an Uncomfortable Conversations panel titled Why We Should Take Down Statues. I think the issues in which Common Ground try to tackle is predominantly the fact that Oxford appears to be in denial on a number of issues regarding heritage and how colonial empire is still embedded within this heritage. First of all, that almost a denial that statues are still not seen or treated with a type of reverence. I think there's a clear way in which memorials are revered and memorials are regarded in public space as opposed to statues. And there seems to be a denial about this and a denial that there needs to be a recontextualization around statues within Oxford, and also a denial that the oppression in which these statues were born, not only in the context in which the people who the statues depict was born in, but the statues themselves, that oppression still exists within Oxford in terms of the present day classism and racism that Common Ground tries to combat. I don't want to take up too much time. I want to pass on to Ines to speak more about Rose Must Fall.
Thank you, Olivia. Good morning to everybody. My name is Ines. I'm co-facilitator of Rose Must Fall, Oxford, where I'm doing my postgrad in environmental governance. There's a lot of points Olivia and Jess have raised that I don't want to repeat too much, but just to give a bit of a background of the movement, it was inspired by the students at the University of Cape Town who demanded and achieved the removal of the Rose statue on their campus. And so since 2015, there's been this group at Oxford calling for the university to acknowledge its colonial history and its attempts and need to uphold the colonial legacy through its monuments. And the predominant one, of course, is the Rhodes statue on top of Oriel College. And last summer, along with the Black Lives Matter protests, we demanded that Oriel College remove the statue. And the college has expressed an interest to do that, but they haven't decided exactly what that will look like, what a post-Rhodes future looks like. And they set up a commission with the promise that 6 months down the line, they would release a decision. But it's now been 10 months and decision still hasn't come out. And I think this actually is very indicative of how powerful statues are, that this whole process around it shows that it's very important to a lot of important and powerful people, because essentially what statues do is represent power and elitism. And to kind of remove that, it's shaking up what the system and the structure is. And so the way I see these kind of processes happening at institutions like Oxford is an attempt to develop a win-win solution. So kind of keep those protesters happy by taking it down, but also may appease those who support it and represent and what it represents to the university. So discussions like, should we take it to a museum, and how should we contextualize it, and what replaces the statue on top of oil. And essentially what this tells us is that statues have one dominant narrative. And in the case of Oxford, it is, even in the discussion of removing the statue, it's about how to preserve it. And so that's why at Rosemouth Hall, along with Common Ground, we find it very, very important to bring the discourse and the fight for decolonization, because essentially decolonizing the space, the curriculum, and the movement is a way to unsettle the structures that keep all of this in place, what has enabled this to have come in the first place. And we hear about decolonization a lot, but actually decolonization is very hard work. It means imagining a future that is not what we're living in now. And I think we have to be quite careful as well, because often it is co-opted by a lot of larger organizations. They say, we want to decolonize, and for them that means to just bring in the discussion of race and colonialism, but it's way more than that. It's not just about recognition, it's about liberation, and it's about bringing different people on the table and constantly working for a world and a space where different views are acknowledged and histories are acknowledged. So what we're trying to do, and what the whole movement represents, is about liberation and about acknowledging history, which is counter to what I think a lot of people who argue against the removal of the statue. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Inès. Thank you for this enlightening point of view, and to close our panel with this your remarks. So I will ask some questions to the panelists, and I will start with this question. In what ways are these monuments oppressive or erasure of certain histories? And what happens when the institution and groups that upload the curated histories behind these monuments are challenged?
I'd be happy to give my opinion if that's okay.
Yes, of sure. I mean, feel free to share. This is where we are.
In answer to the question of how these monuments are in kind of an active erasure of particular heritage or history, I think it's quite interesting to look at how memorials of war are treated in comparison to statues that, for example, we see in Oxford, in Codrington and Rhodes. As with war, the sides seem to be very, very clear, and so when the victors win, those lost on our side, it's very clear that we can make memorials and people can go into public space and can mourn the loss, whereas there are, the city that we walk around in is built upon a mass amount of loss of life, and yet there's no clear sign of memorial, and I think that is because you still have memorials of people like Rhodes and people like Codrington in the city. There's no sense of memorial and no sense of mourning for loss, or even in terms of reparations is ever going to happen if you still have the statues of the people that caused such loss in the first place and caused such oppression in the first place. as I think it was Professor Shahid said, if you have these symbols of democracy alongside symbols of oppression, it doesn't exactly make sense, and it also denies the fact that particular statues are going to be seen in particular ways. So yeah, that's what I think on the matter.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. Very interesting. And I would like to know, what do you think, what will constitute as a solution to what becomes of these monuments? Don't be shy.
If I can try and answer.
Go ahead, you are welcome.
Well, actually, it's not really an answer, because what becomes of them, I think, is part of what was just mentioned by Olivia. How do we democratically decide on what kind of monuments do we want? So, for example, the removal of the road statue at the University of Cape Town was not about the road statue in itself. It was also preceded by years of racial profiling of students, of prejudice at the university, lack of advancement of Black scholarship, a very Eurocentric syllabus. So all of those kinds of issues were at stake, apart from questions around gender, colonialism, what road stood for, and so on. So all of these came to a head. So one solution was obviously the road statue must move. It was within 30 days. But other statues and other memorials might require a different kind of approach. And if we are saying that we must restore history, stop the erasure, recognize oppression, and what it has done, and what kind of traumatic conditions as it plays out currently, then we must have that kind of debate about what does it mean when you put a statue of Mandela alongside somebody who obviously stood for racial oppression, segregation, exploitation. And what does it mean, for example, in one of the other capital cities in the country, where one monument, which was dedicated almost exclusively to one particular section of the population, namely Afrikaner settlers, which is supposed to speak directly to a new monument called Freedom Park, which is supposed to symbolize all that that democracy stands for, and whether this particular form of experiment has worked or not. Some people, myself included, would say that it hasn't quite worked out that way. So you have a range. Removal, one where you try to get different monuments to speak to one another. But I think more fundamentally, we have to ask, why monuments, and in what form are we doing it? Are we following it the way in which colonialists have erected statues, or is it some new form that we need to try and find? And so it is, I think, a lot about future thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add something quickly, Alize.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on what has been said so far. It just got me thinking, because when I think of a statue, in a public space, it's there to, it says something celebratory about it. It's about, these are, it kind of feels like we need to celebrate, acknowledge them. But what if we move those monuments or statues of oppression maybe to a museum? So people like, who wants to view those colonialists and those that are, the tyrants, it could actually be a place to showcase, oh, these are the people that oppressed the world, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. So people have a choice to go and see them. So in a way, we're not celebrating them, they're not in our spaces, but we can still acknowledge, because I still believe in history, acknowledging history, seeing, who and what and where. So in one way, what I just thought about now is that, take this, images of oppression to a space where it is not celebrated, where in a museum, but maybe not a statue. It could be another way to, showcase or emphasize history. So that's just what I thought I should add there. Taking them away from the public spaces, putting them in a museum where people have a choice to go and view these people if they want to, rather than being in a space where we have no choice than to see them on our everyday activities.
Thank you. I would like to remind to all of you that you can also respond to the audience in the Q&A box. So right now we have one question, from Dr. Ndukeye Ndulu, sorry if I didn't pronounce well. So, considering that monuments have their admirers, as can be seen in the delays of decisions about what happens to some of those that are being actively challenged, can we ever achieve equality where everyone is happy with the heritage landscape around them?
Personally, in answer to that question, I think it hits at the heart of the need for democratic decision behind statues and memorialization. Almost, I think it's encapsulated by the idea of every statue should be put up with the intention for it to one day fall. Attitudes change and viewpoints change from generation to generation. And I don't think there will ever be a point in which a complete community can always agree upon kind of the statues or memorializations that are within their kind of immediate landscape. However, there needs to be a constant space for everyone to have a say in whether they find a particular statue oppressive, whether it emotes particularly kind of violent emotional response. And I think this should be kind of a way in which communities can actually have a say in the values in which their city or their landscape or their heritage is kind of is shown in kind of physical form.
Yeah, just kind of going on from what Liv said, I feel like it would be really great to kind of see a movement away from seeing statues as a way of just sort of fixing in one, version of one narrative, one perspective, and more just kind of seeing them as just like a fluid discussion, kind of, like what we're doing here, just as a way of talking about different perspectives and narratives, and acknowledging, like kind of Liv said, that these statues aren't really built for time immemorial. They're just another way of kind of exploring cultural identity and heritage. So I guess kind of shifting the discussion towards a more kind of discussion and debate rather than as a way of just kind of preserving a certain narrative, I guess.
Thank you. We have another question addressed to all the panelists. How much of a risk does removing a statue from its intended display area pose to the context in which it is understood?
Can you ask that again? I did not understand.
How much of a risk does removing a statue from its intended display area pose to the context in which it is understood? You can check it out also in the box for the Q&A.
I think it's, in my personal opinion, I think it's less of a risk and more of an opportunity to remove a statue from its intended context. Because unfortunately, for example, if we take Rhodes, the Rhodes statue doesn't only represent the context in which Rhodes was alive, but it also represents the context in which Oriel College believed it was okay to take money from Rhodes as a benefactor and put a statue of him in front of the college, which in itself is a particular context different from his lifetime. And that is the context in which we're trying to remove. That's the context in which we're trying to change. And so I think removing the statue from its intended area and placing it, as Adaku said, in a museum. I think there's a brilliant example of a museum in Munich, which actually calls itself a documentation center instead of a museum, because it's seen as kind of a place of education about the war crimes of the Nazi Party. And so it's not really a museum as we have in Oxford with many artifacts that are also part of a colonial past. It's a museum that's dedicated to education. And I think, personally, I think it's an opportunity to remove a statue from a context in which these statues are revered, to a context in which we understand the need for education and we want to replace the context.
Thank you. And
if I could say.
Oh, yes, for sure.
Yes, sure. Firstly, when the Rhodes statue was being at University of Cape Town, well, it was also suggested it goes to museums. Almost universally, the museums in South Africa said they don't want it. And the reason was because they themselves are involved in their own decolonial projects. And why would they want Rhodes to be amongst them when they've got their own issues to deal with? So, I mean, it suggests a more fundamental idea around what does heritage mean going into the future. I mean, the suggestions around a greater participation is one way. But I mean, I like the idea of statues or monuments or heritage sites being able to be in a dialogue not only with the citizens, but also with other such monuments. And instead of them being seen as something which should exist for all time, they have to be seen in many different ways. And we can't predict what those ways might be, but if we can lay down some principles around how this should be done, they should not depict conquest of indigenous peoples. It should not be glorification of colonialism, no discrimination of whatever kind. There must be some level of participation around what and how they should be put into a kind of historical landscape rather than as solitary figures, because that's what it happens. I mean, you go anywhere in Europe and you will see a man on a horse having done something or the other, and this is the great. It feeds into the great man theory around of history, and quite clearly this is not the case. We talked about war memorials, but we never talk about, we talk about the victors and the losers, but the Second World War was not fought in Europe alone. So, you know, it was fought all over the place. And so was the First World War. And there were many Black people that played a role in these wars, sometimes in roles that were basically as servants, but you know, some of them also fought on the battlefront. Those kinds of things are never mentioned. Right? And sometimes they were put into battle, not because they actually wanted to be there, sometimes because they had no choice. So those kinds of issues never come out. And it's time that those kinds of things begin to emerge out of however we want to construe these new kind of heritage landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we have three other questions from the audience. The audience is very excited about, you know, our panelists. And we have a question, three questions from Sarah May. Do any of the panelists have experience of the impact of status being removed? Does the removal check up the structures of oppression or simply remove the particular painful expression? And the last question, thinking of Oxford, colonial structure of thought pervade the city, how much can we expect from the removal of status?
Perhaps I could step in here. The removal definitely does shake up structures. That's not to say that it removes the structures. That wouldn't be possible with one statue, and even in one generation. This is something that this is a product of what's gone on for hundreds of years. And so it will take a very long time as well to break down those structures. But it's what it is, it's one step towards that. And I think, and that's what's very important for Rose Must Fall. We don't believe, okay, when the statue is gone, then we're fine. That's just kind of, I guess, really the start. There's a lot of work that goes before and after. And I think to the second point, you know, how much can we expect, considering that the structures of thought pervade the city? That is a very good question. There's a lot of talk in decolonial space that there's only so much you can achieve using the tools of the master, right? So there's this phrase like, you cannot break down the master's house with his tools. And that is the case here as well. But you have to get to a certain point in order to kind of bring that down. And that's where we are at the moment. I mean, this is still in very specific spaces that we're having these discussions. It's not really mainstream, and if it is, it's spoken in a very niche way. So we do have a long way to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add something there. Alize?
Yes, sure.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so, you know, that question reminds me of the experience of, you know, what we had here in Ireland, where this hotel I mentioned about, it's a landmark hotel, it's a celebrity hotel that is huge. So, you know, and last year, 4 of the structures that represented oppression, like I said, these were women, images of slave girls in shackles on their feet and their hands and all that. So when that was removed, I thought that was, the positive thing was that the hotel wasn't under pressure in a way to take it off, but it was in a way that, of course, with what was going on in the world, that was maybe they felt the pressure, but I actually appreciated that they just quickly, without any resistance, they just removed it. So I think, you know, when you topple, whether it's a statue or remove those monuments of oppression, there is this sense of, you know, voice or power back to the oppressed. There's this sense of movement forwards. There's this sense of, you know, relief. Okay, we are getting there. We're not there, but it begins that conversation. I think it opened up that mindset, and awakeness and reckoning about racism, particularly in the Irish context. Because in Ireland, where I live, you know, Ireland has been a country that has been known for being very friendly. You know, there's this term they use in Irish language. It says "Céad Mille Páirtear." It means a land of thousand welcomes. So Ireland has that image of welcome. But but the same Ireland is the second most racist country in the whole of EU. So when you see this, you know, very friendly, it's like an iceberg. On the surface, you know, we're all friendly, it looks friendly, but when you look at the system, the structures, you realize that there is so much systemic racism, you know, within Ireland. So I think that, you know, toppling of this statute actually, you know, I think it creates awareness. There's a shift in mindset, shift in conversations, and I think that is really at the stage where we are now. I could honestly say that I can see changes moving towards the right direction in terms of, you know, awareness, conversations, learning, and even employment for people from, particularly those from the Black communities. So yes, it is moving the dial.
Thank you, Adeku, for your insightful opinion and view of, you know, of this matter of removal of status as well. So we have also a last question from the audience. Considering that museums are also remains of a colonial past and operating within colonial structures that in many ways continue to reproduce colonial narrative, do you think that placing monuments within museums is a really good solution?
I completely agree with what this question states. As I'm a history finalist at Oxford, and I'm wanting to go into work in museums, predominantly in kind of decolonization work. So I completely understand the kind of tension here. If you were to relocate a statue or any piece of kind of physical heritage into a space in which even the way that we walk around museums, the way that we label artifacts, the way that we put particular kind of figures in kind of glass cases, and we gaze up at them, and the way that we act in a museum, especially in the UK, is a product of empire. And so placing a statue in this context doesn't necessarily achieve that much. And so decolonization has to happen in public space as well as in academic space and in museum space. I think I still do think that removing a statue from public space into a context of discussion and academic discussion that's accessible to all is the answer, but I think that requires a level of significant reform in museums beforehand to get to a point where there are more museums in this country and across the globe that are dedicated to education instead of kind of a culture of just looking at artifacts that don't actually come from your own country, and instead more of a place of education about the real kind of harm that, you know, people in your country have actually gone through and harm that your country has committed.
Thank you, Olivia, for sharing your insight. And I have one last question for all the panelists. Do you think that museums can be understood as monuments, reminders of colonial past, keeping hostage objects and stories from other cultures, that is to say, exerting oppression? And if that is the case, what actions should we take to revert this?
If I can start answering that question. So I think part of this is part of a global debate, which the International Council of Museums has already started. They started this in 2019 about decolonizing museums. And part of that was redefining what we mean by museums, because for many people, museums are places of alienation rather than places of welcome, because they can't see themselves in these museums, particularly museums that have been built in the former colonies, because they mimic the museums of Europe and the United States. And so, there is a broader conversation. Very specific to my part of the world, there are many, many museums that have started on the decolonial trail. Some of them have made some successes, others not. So here in Cape Town, there's a slavery museum that has been re-examining the history of slavery, who came here as slaves, who from the indigenous populations were enslaved, and what have been the effects. And they've also traced how the slave trade worked. And some of it is leading to complete re-evaluations, particularly of the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade tends to view these things as mostly people coming from West Africa to the Caribbean and the United States, and of course to Brazil and other parts of South America as well. But now we're beginning to show that the slave trade involved the Indian Ocean as well. So not just the Indian Ocean itself amongst themselves, but slaves coming from Madagascar, from Mozambique, being taken all the way to the Americas. So so this is part of a process of beginning to investigate, provide the research, and put up the exhibitions that show this, and bring in a completely different kind of audience to the museums, less elite and more of the population that can see themselves in these kinds of museums. And that would apply including to science. For example, a lot of the illustrations that you see in books, zoology, botany, and so on, in many of the museums in Europe, were people that came to the colonies. They made these drawings, they did these experiments. This is knowledge from the global south that is in the museums in the north. It's not their knowledge, it's people from the global south. And to begin to re-look at that means to ask the questions about whether scientific knowledge and the way in which it is presented in museums is as appropriate as it seems. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add something quickly, Alice.
Yeah.
So yes, so yes, absolutely. I think that, many museums have legacies that are rooted in colonialism. Their collections were from wealthy donors who benefited from these empires. So in terms of solutions, one or two things I could share is about, of course, we know that some of these museums are beginning to return this artifact or looted artifact. So it's so important. I think that is one way to do that. But I think there's also an opportunity to lease these arts from the real owners, because you've kept them for 100 years, 200 years. So there, in order to, for the sake of reparations, they could consider leasing this artifacts from the real owners. So while they return them, is there an opportunity? You pay them and continue to have access to them. So, and another point that it's in terms of biases, even the overhaul should start with the decision makers? Who are the people who are making the decisions about these exhibitions? What is shown in the exhibition, and how is the story told? Do they have a decolonial mindset? Are they, that's the decision makers, are they even aware of their own biases of what they choose to showcase and what they don't? And how inclusive are these artifacts? So just being mindful around that what does not belong to you has to be returned. And if you still want to have access to it, lease the arts, pay the rightful owners of those artifacts, and you can have access to them.
Thank you, Adeku, and thank you to all panelists. Welcome back, everyone. How was your tea break?
Good.
Good.
Yes.
We need more energy. I know, here in New York is very early.
I'm sure it is.
So let's get back to one of the questions of the audience. Eben asked, the statues were returned to the hotel by the state. Politicians and many in Ireland insisted that the statues were part of preserved building. The actions of the company seemed more performative than actually doing the right thing. They did not resist or challenge the state when they insisted on bringing the statues back. White academics also came out to say the statues were not of enslaved girls. What role do you see academics playing? So this question is addressed to all panelists, so feel free to answer.
I feel like Adaku will be able to say more specifically the role of the academics in the removal of the statues. On a more wide scale, as someone who has kind of thought about going into academia for a long time, I think I've realized that what I personally see is the role of academics playing in wider kind of decolonization work within heritage is making academia accessible to people who aren't in a privileged kind of academic environment, whether that be through work in public space, work in heritage space, even work in media and in other ways, allowing history and heritage to be a discussion that all people can get involved with, instead of a discussion that is exclusive to a kind of certain group of people that often is quite exclusive in terms of class as well as race and gender. Yeah, that's the main thing for me for academia is accessibility.
Thank you, Olivia, for your answer. Anyone else?
I suppose as an academic, I better say something. Of course, let's just go to this problem where white academics came out to say the statues were not of enslaved girls. I mean, I'd really like to see on what basis they make the claim, if indeed we have girls who were, or rather the statues of girls that were shackled. It's an obvious conclusion. And if they were not slaves, then they were certainly shackled for other reasons, which then raises not only the question around whether they were slaves or not, it also raises the question around what kind of gender relations pertained where they could be shackled. And so it doesn't make the issue go away by merely saying that the statues were not of enslaved girls or enslaved girls. It in fact raises more issues than previously. So I guess academics need to ask those kinds of questions, further questions, and that's the role of academics, to ask questions and to be critical. But there's another issue here where specifically, well, not just here, but it's been raised in other parts of the world as well, when they say that when you remove a statue or you remove a monument, you're also removing history. And one has to answer that question, or rather that comment. And the point is, it's not removing. When you remove or you change or you rearrange statues and monuments and heritage sites, what you are doing is, in fact, if restoring a more correct version of history, or you are restoring history and heritage that was erased, and that these things speak to one another as part of the colonial entanglement. It wasn't only about physical violence, it was also about what has been called in various ways the colonization of the mind. And we have to address that question as well as academics. How do we go from monuments to the intangible aspects of what those statues and monuments represent? And the decolonizing, or the colonizing and the decolonizing of the mind becomes critical there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So I would like also now to have the pleasure to welcome back Deepak Srinivas, Ndukayou Ndouvlou, Kelly Pollard, Paul-Edouard Mangori Ramirez, and Vincha Kisik from the webinar series, who can absolutely share also, if they want, to give their comment about the topics. Welcome back. Is Deepak there?
Yeah, okay. I'm here.
So feel free to add some comments or share some opinion, others also. So.
Can I step in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, having listened to the discussions this morning, I wonder whether it confirms that history will always be changed from one generation to another. And at times, I think it can be changed more than once within the same generation. And I'm saying that because if there are a group of people who looks at a particular monument, and to them, you know, they see, you know, something that, you know, makes them happy. And yet there is another group that looks at the same monument and have a completely different experience. What it says to me, therefore, is that there will always be different opinions about anything in life, and the same applies to monuments. The monument that was cherished yesterday is being challenged, you know, today. It might fall, you know, and a new monument is put up, but that same monument will be challenged, you know, equally tomorrow. And in the same way, as a South African, we might be seeing, you know, more monuments, and a very big monuments of Nelson Mandela today, but there are equally people who might rise up against that, you know, in the next generation and challenge, you know, Mandela, not for some, not on the basis of what some accuse him to have been a terrorist, but on the basis, for example, I mean, it's an argument's sake, on the basis of having been the first president of a country, you know, under a political party that may not be, you know, well supported, as we are already beginning to see at the moment. So I'm therefore saying that we should just accept that monuments will always be challenged, you know, at any given moment, whatever monuments we put up, and however we try to correct the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ndukaye. Anyone else who would like to share, give some comments about the topic?
Yeah, hello. I like to share comments as well. And well, first, thanks to all the morning speakers for really interesting insights and also the struggles they're involved in. Well, I think there was a really interesting, well, few interesting points being discussed this morning, but one of them was actually that. And Professor Shahid was mentioning this, and then Olivia Duval was kind of developing further on that idea, and that is that we can't really just focus on monuments without focusing on much wider forms of oppression that we live in today's world, and that basically all our systems and our landscapes and our cities are being constructed upon. So I think that these questions that monuments raise are really the questions that have to be addressed much more wider than when it comes to should we remove something or not remove something, or should we put it in museum and decolonize museums, so that it really kind of, it has a spillover effect on all kind of areas of society, not only one society, but really across the globe. And I think this is also the key problem for why this kind of, well, the struggle of Black Lives Movement and many other movements that call for kind of liberation and not oppression has not become a dominant discourse, has not become something that is kind of taken on by the political elites, taken on by the majority of people, and so on and so forth, because its spillover effects would mean kind of really radically changing the world as it is now. And this is what Olivia has pointed out. And I think it's really interesting and informative to look at what has happened in the Eastern Europe and in former Yugoslavia, so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in terms exactly of kind of monuments and statues and heritage interpretation, because even though that was not about kind of colonialism in a kind of narrow sense of the world, it really showed that once the kind of ideological, kind of the whole ideological perspective changes, once the economic structure change, once the social relations change, then it's very easy to actually remove certain statues from the kind of communist times and put them in museums, put them in the special heritage parks, even destroy them without ever being, you know, prosecuted for the crimes and so on and so forth. So I think if in that case there was kind of a consensus, at least from the side of political elites, that this is something that is needed to be done. And this is something that is desirable. And that was not just related to monuments, but that kind of relationship towards monuments was a reflection of much wider ideological shift. And of course, yeah, there's like, we can have different ideological views regarding that particular time. And I have my own and have been writing about this. And of course, the fact that the heritage dissonance that has remained still is really not being settled by just removing them. But I think that what we lack at the moment is actually we lack this kind of broader will of political elites to be changing something substantially. And I think this is what is also kind of driving back much of the discussion around, you know, Black Lives Matters protests or Me Too movements and other movements that are going on, Fridays for Future, and so on and so forth, because they really threaten to shake and restructure the world power relations as they are now.
Thank you for your input. So we have another question from the audience, from Mikey, who's saying is, enjoying listening very much and always wonder what can civil society do in this process and how do we include civil society? Anyone?
Yeah, maybe I can respond to that a little bit. So I'm actually based in Bangalore, India. My name is Deepak Srinivasan. I was part of the panel, the webinar on decolonizing gender in public spaces. And my work really is based in the public space and kind of looks at memory. So they are kind of intersections of space and time. And I'm an artist primarily and a designer, and that's my work, just to give it a context. So over the last decade, actually, my work has been to kind of engage with activist groups and NGOs and marginalized communities, people who work with marginalized groups and communities. Also because in India, it's a bit of a invisibilized sector for various reasons. Mostly the civil society is looked at as, action in the civil society is looked at as charity. And some of the really sophisticated work that the civil society groups are doing in terms of conflict interventions, management, is not really known in the public realm. And also the need for creative interventions to enter the activist space. So that's really been my work, to kind of work with taking in art and art-based tools and design-based tools into the social sector. And in the process, I did sort of engage with museums, because it is a part of the public space work. But there is really a kind of impoverishment of a lot of spaces, and especially the public space. There is a lack of interest and a lack of engagement, but there's a lot of need to want to claim the space, either through monumentalization, politicization, primarily politicizing the space in a way that is problematic. Somehow I feel civil society groups get into a very confrontational mode in the public realm, and they've not really managed to have a conversation. And I think there is, especially in India, an urgent need to have creative conversations and to get civil society to talk about their work, to communicate their work. And I think museums in the public realm, or processes of what could look like museums, or what could create dialogue in the public realm, is really needed. The work of civil society, especially in the Indian context, needs to be highlighted in the right form, because also there is a kind of polarization of all civil societies being clumped together as left-leaning, left liberal, and hence a lot of right-wing kind of action against them, especially with the right-wing in power. So there is a lot of polarization, which nobody is really looking at as a kind of a consequence of colonialism. And there are all these imagined kind of enemies, or like Islamic and Muslim kind of influences, and this kind of very polarization of culture that is taking place. And there is really an urgent need to involve civil society in creative ways, to one, visualize itself, to have creative strategies and communicate their work, and use a lot of tools apart from the standard protest and law and order mechanisms to deal with what is going on in my country. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Deepak. And I would like to say that everyone is invited, to interact, all the panelists before and those who just joined us from the webinar, to discuss more, since we have at least 1 hour, to exchange, so feel free to share or to add your comments.
Thank you. If I could just add something onto what Deepak said. I was able to attend a wonderful discussion a few weeks ago from two amazing speakers. I unfortunately can't remember their full names, but one was a director of the Liverpool museums, one of which being the International Slavery Museum in the UK, and one was the director and curator in the Johannesburg Apartheid Museum. And the director of the Liverpool's museum spoke about how within Liverpool there are hundreds of street names that are named in connection to Liverpool's role in the Atlantic slave trade, and how within Liverpool there's been a very kind of rich discussion over the last generation or so that discussing kind of how the community and the civil society within Liverpool in particular are wanting to relate to that history and are wanting to accept that history and display it in a better kind of recontextualized way. And I think that's one of the most important things that civil society can kind of get involved in the decolonization work in heritage is make these spaces in which people can share their opinions on whether they think that their kind of streets, that their physical landscape around them, what that symbolizes to them, and whether it should be changed. Because if it's a community effort, then what we've seen in Liverpool is that people decided that changing, you know, over nearly 200 street names all at once might not be practical for transport, but there were opportunities to change this in another way and recontextualize Liverpool and its relation to the slave trade. So yeah, I think community discussion, I think, is central.
Thank you, Olivia. I would like to get back to Dr. Elena, since previously you share very interesting input. I would like to know if you can even maybe add more information or comments to our discussion.
Yes, I have to admit that I'm fascinated by this topic, but it's very difficult for me to engage with it because Italy considers itself as a non-colonial country, or at least we are trying to forget our colonial history using the discourse of our colonial politics was more human than the British or the French one. So somehow I would like to be a little bit provocative with you, saying that you are using monuments to decolonize history or museum to decolonize these stories, but we don't have we don't have history museum, which is a shocking, but it is true. We don't have monuments about our colonial past and colonial characters. So it is very difficult for us as academic or museum professional to discuss topic like our past colonialism. So I was also wondering if these monuments could somehow be a vehicle to be critical about our past and our present as well, because of course we have problems with migrations and cultural differences, but we struggle to discuss this topic because we don't have, how can I say, conflictual public spaces. I don't know if you have any suggestions or if I can give you some thoughts to think about.
If I can make a suggestion. Well, I mean, Italy did occupy Ethiopia and that part of the world. And one of its consequences is in Asmara, where the one of two modernist World Heritage Sites is located, and that's a direct consequence of Italian colonialism. So there is that. I mean, Italy was not a great colonial power. In large part, Italy's lack of colonial rule in the way that, say, the Dutch or the Portuguese or the English or the French was largely the consequence of the Ottoman Empire's block on trade with the East. And so Western European countries found a way around the Horn of Africa into the Indian Ocean and then to the East Indies. But then Italy has had a long, complicated history with both the Ottoman Empire and previous engagements with various empires, including various portions of the Islamic Empire from about 800 AD onwards. And that part of Italy's history is kind of silent when you in places like Rome or Florence or
Venice.
Venice, to be more precise. And so I would imagine that engagement is quite important, because the way Eurocentrism is portrayed is that it rises up in Greece and in Rome and then spreads westwards. But in fact, it may not be like that at all. It may have been a very complicated history with everything to the east before it went west. And I think that aspect of Italy is just, well, on the two occasions that I've been, or the one occasion that I've been in Rome, it's just completely absent. It's just not there. What also struck me about being in Rome, I mean, in all respects, it was a wonderful experience. But what struck me was how closely Italy follows the World Heritage Convention in the way it portrays its monuments. And other parts of the world are arguing, well, it's not really about the built environment only. It's much more than just the built environment. That's why we have an intangible heritage convention as well. And so it also means that those aspects need to be understood and within, I guess, within it. I mean, I can't really comment on how things happen in Italy, but it just struck me that, yeah, the monuments are extremely Eurocentric. I mean, the Roman Empire extended way beyond into what is sometimes called the Levant or Asia Minor or now the Middle East. And that's just completely absent.
Yes, absolutely. Because Rome was the power, so everyone has to be submitted by its model. Yes. So there was no way to include. It wasn't an inclusive empire, of course.
Yeah.
I would also like to remind there are at least 20 monuments to Christopher Columbus in Genoa. So there are dozens and dozens of monuments to the figure of horror for Latin America. And so that these, you know, and I mean, obviously, you know, there's always different ways to paint this figure, but, you know, I'm going to go with From a Voice in Latin America. Nobody thinks anything good of this person. He has this absolute nightmare background to him. And I live in the United States currently with a large Italian-American community, and they're very, very proud of Christopher Columbus still. And I live close to a city that is named after him. So there's still a lot of unpacking of this figure who is the, you know, the face of colonization that could go on in Italy. You've got a number of cities. It's not just Genoa that has images and monuments to this person, but there's some in Rome. I mean, there's a huge list of Columbus monuments all over the country of Italy. And just because, you know, he did this in the service of Spain, you know, of the Spanish kingdom, doesn't make it that different. You know, he's still a part of this story. And, you know, especially since there have been a bunch of monuments in Italy to him, then surely Italy sees him as a part of their story as well then.
Yeah, but there is an actual debate about this fact. This is the problem. I mean, in a positive and a negative way, because it is considered just from an historical point of view as an Italian character we should be proud of. We don't see the consequences.
Sure, and that's one of the issues is, you know, there's always the ability to kind of pass the buck, as the phrase goes. You know, because again, the Italian people, you know, or the different Italian kingdoms didn't do this, didn't do what Spain did to Latin America. But the fact that there are all these monuments and there is, you know, a wider discussion around the world about this person, you know, has been for years and years. It's, you know, the fact that Italy doesn't problematize and doesn't voice more about how troubling of a figure this person is. That's definitely something that can and should change. And you do have then the space, you absolutely have the spaces to have these conversations, and these conversations about how so many of these heavily imperialistic Western societies absolutely adored the Roman Empire. And so Italy has all of the spaces to talk about that inheritance that other empires, that, you know, the United States is littered with all of these pseudo-Roman style buildings, loved the Romans. And so there's absolutely the space to talk about how the Romans have been and are used. And just because Italy did not exactly do these things doesn't mean that there's not a part of the conversation that Italy absolutely should be ethically obliged to participate in.
Yes, and I think that one of our problem, especially in the museum sector, is that all these objects or even monuments are considered just from artistic or aesthetical point of view. They are completely, they become just simple aesthetic objects with no reflection of a wider social and historical context. So it's difficult, because if this kind of reflection doesn't start from academics, I feel like we will always be stuck in the same point. And this, for example, your example of statues from Cristoforo Colombo, I think it would be really interesting to start a dialogue with migrants coming from Southern America, for example. How do they feel about these statues? Does it mean anything for them? Do they feel, let's say, oppressed by this kind of representation of the past? I don't know if this could be a good idea. I mean, you are more aware.
It would be a bit troubling regardless, because it would be asking, you know, Latin migrants to do the emotional labor of the Italian people, you know, and I don't know if that's necessarily fair to put on to people who, you know, I don't know many, you know, Latin Americans in Italy, but I know plenty of Latin Americans who live in Spain, and just the marginal existences that they end up having in Spain. So I'm not certain if that's similar in Italy, which then in that same sense might not necessarily be fair to place the mantle of, hey, we need to have this conversation onto them, you know?
Yeah, the problem is to find a way to start a conversation, because the problem is Italy is still a very Italian-centered country. Like, we really understand ourselves from an Italian point of view, Italian heritage, and we don't have as much connection with other culture as it may happen in Great Britain, for example. So it is very difficult for someone. I studied in the in UK, so I'm more aware of such debates. But someone, even academics, having studied here in Italy, they don't have they are not sensitive enough to start this conversation. So I think the problem is to find a way to make this debate starting in an effective way, which is not just historical or artistic, as I said before.
Thank you, thank you. So Marco has an interesting question. So could you develop more about this? Marco?
Yes, are you referring to the chat? Yeah, I was wondering about this. Reference to Colombo. I'm Italian, but it's not referred to that. So I was extending this kind of reasoning to the extreme. And so now we are in a sort of global society, and maybe one of the persons that is representing us is this Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, no, that went to the moon some 50 years ago, and somehow is opening up new worlds. So for us, it's a sort of a reference person. We are making monuments of him, but what about if he's opening up new worlds and others' equilibria? So is he somebody that we have to remember forever, or is there a danger that is breaking up others' rights? And at the same time, I'm wondering, what about reducing this debate to what we are doing to the other living beings, like animals, for example? So I think that the problem is that we cannot question history. So history is a matter of time, and there are a lot of examples that show. I live, for example, in Gorica and Novagorica. That examples where time has been, reducing this gap. And monuments, as I wrote in the chat, are from the Latin word, are there to admonish. So there is not always a positive or a negative meaning behind the word monuments. They are just there to remind you of something. So it could be, an imposition, but could also be a layer in history that made good and also made bad. It's important to be to take a sort of abstract position to that, and maybe to respond with other monuments. In the chat, there was also a question about having monuments or not. I think that monuments, and this is, in the conservation doctrine, we make monuments on purpose, but sometimes things are becoming monuments by themselves, simply because we want to restore them or because we attach some meanings to them. We have examples of natural world heritage that is becoming monuments because we assign some meanings, I would say some qualities to it, not because it was created on purpose to tell us something good or bad. So I believe if I take the example of Novagorica, I mean, here we have a border, and the border existed from the end of the Second World War and was dividing two societies that were the day before, I mean, not the day before, I would say, but before the war, they were just mixing up every day. So there was, and this is the problem, for example, of former Yugoslavia, where people were normally talking each other every day, and then from one moment to another, they were not anymore. So they were enemies. And I think that the monuments are there to remind you that something that history is making bad things, good things and bad things, I would say. And you have to remember that. And this is why we have history. So I would maybe insist on the fact that we have to make much more education on history. And I can tell you that this is not the case. I mean, I sometimes as Italian, I'm told that we do too much history, but we do this history not only to tell us that we were good, because the Roman Empire was good in your perspective, but also for the Italians it was bad, because the Romans were conquering also other territories inside the present territory of Italy. So they were bad also for us in a certain perspective. But time made it different. I mean, we accepted the monuments in a way or another, and we know that they are there to tell us that something was good and something was bad. I mean, it's maybe our reaction to history. So I think that we may enter into, I mean, into very fragile, I mean, lens now. It's important to understand, I believe, the role of history, and that tangible things, and I don't do distinctions between intangible and tangible. And tangible things are the only things that are telling us about something that is not talking anymore. So maybe it's good to have them, even though they are uncomfortable sometimes.
Thank you, Michael. So we have another question from Elmadi CPDI from Global Studio. So I'll let you ask a question. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Very interesting conversation. I kind of come from an architectural background, and just thinking about architecture as monuments, and thinking about how all over the continent, you know, the African continent, the architecture that we build now, it's all mostly colonial, and it's quite oppressive. You have people not developing their own architectural languages because of the stigma attached. And so important these monumental design ideologies and their built environment is basically what is expected. Using European architecture shows you've arrived, you're civilized. And I don't know, I just wanted to get kind of some feedback from the panelists. How does that conversation play in your research, in your findings, in the struggle to decolonize monuments? How does architecture fit into the work?
Thank you. Oh, someone else has to add something or any comment? Feel free to share with us.
No, I was just going to use that context to develop a little bit on remembering. And I feel the idea of remembering through structural monuments, architectural kind of spaces, or even, you know, kind of natural heritage, I think that in itself seems a little, I mean, it seems to come from a certain kind of show and tell, which is maybe not a part of, say, African culture or Asian culture in terms of how they remember. And I think remembering also has the other aspect, which is forgetting, which I think in the modern period, we are really not talking about forgetting as well, because remembering and forgetting really help or have helped a lot of communities, groups, and then, you know, like provinces and regions to forgive as well, because there is a lot of forgiveness that has had to come before the democratic kind of ideas that came into humankind. So I think one is the aspect of remembering differently, which for me is really about dismantling space and time, and how things are kind of, how traditionally, different communities kind of would like this to happen. And it takes me back to this idea of living heritage, really, because do we really need heritage that's not living anymore? Or can we also instrumentalize heritage that can be living through, so it stays in context? And why I say this is, as a performer and a storyteller, I really feel that the ephemeral nature of these forms are more exciting to me when I talk about or think about heritage than the materiality of what is shown or framed in a space. And so, I mean, I don't want to create a binary there, but as a designer, I've been trying to see how we can work with taking away this kind of absolute fixed idea about placing an object, by bringing in performativity, by bringing in storytelling, which comes and goes and which changes over a period of time without labeling the object, and also enabling a kind of impermanence to the object, because the idea of the monument or the museum is to not touch, but a lot of African Asian cultures is also about touch, tactile kind of ideas, and you can hold something and it falls and it breaks, or it doesn't break. And so those ideas of how to engage with objects, I mean, the value ascribed to it is also very colonial kind of idea, right? Like, you have to preserve something for posterity, and there is no time, no cycle for it to get destroyed in that sense. So these are two challenges that I threw out there in terms of how do we want to remember. And I think it's very hard to let go, because museums in that sense have ascribed so much value to what is shown and how it is shown and how it is placed, that we really need to also start learning to let go. Is something I wanted to share.
Yeah, I think we were having a little bit of that conversation, and I'm sorry, I guess it was just between panelists, not everyone. But we were actually talking about, how we could and probably should normalize impermanence and normalize the destruction and decay of, we were talking specifically about monuments, but yeah, as well for objects too. And I always kind of thought it was a little weird at all the museum settings that I kind of worked with, whenever there were objects that were meant to be touched, that the public could be able to be held, kind of the term that was usually used for them is like sacrificial pieces, as if that act is a sacrifice to us. It's a little strange. And I definitely think that especially in kind of a lot of the understandings that we have of tangible heritage is that, yeah, everything has to be preserved. Everything is for some unknown future, that it has to be preserved forever. That's not reality. That is completely counter to existence. Not to be overly metaphysical about this, but everything inevitably decays. Everything goes away, and we should not pretend that it doesn't, especially with monuments, with so-called ruins, these places. We have to accept that and normalize it. I don't think it's healthy to do it otherwise.
Thank you all. I want to call back Dr. Nkuye. Oh, go ahead.
That I think the idea of history itself, in terms of how timelines are imagined, again is a kind of Eurocentric idea, and in which time can be imagined in terms of how it begins and how it ends, and how the location of events can also interchange. Mythic time meets real time in very unique ways in different cultures. And I feel that also lends itself to a certain kind of imagination and plurality versus fixing objects and events in a way that is historic. And so the historicity, the idea of historicity is also something I think one should really start looking at more closely in terms of the urge to map events, and how do we do that?
Thank you.
Elise, if I could just
go ahead.
Say, so Dr. Ndlovu asked me what do I mean by we, and that we always means dissenting voices.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm going to use the Rhodes Must Fall movement and precisely the Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town. At some point in the 4 weeks, there was going to be a panel discussion about the statue itself. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the panel discussion obviously had many different views, many different dissenting voices, but there were 3 or 4 very important aspects to that panel. One was there was going to be experts. These were both professors from the university, but also people from the National Heritage Agency that oversees the monuments. There was going to be the university leadership, and there were students, and amongst the students there were differing voices. What was important about all of this was that the debate did not take place because none of them were working from an equal perspective, from an equal standing. In other words, the people from the National Heritage Agency were there as custodians of monuments. They had the weight of law and policy behind them. The university leadership had the weight of their authority. The students had, at least the ones that were asking for the statue to be removed, had their moral authority and their political authority behind them, but they did not have any institutional power. These are all different sources of power. So when we argue that there are dissenting voices, we must be aware of where these dissenting voices are coming from and with what perspective, because they're not all the same thing. We can't have a debate without being informed about what influence and power you bring to such a debate. Only then can you begin to talk about a public culture of debate, when one understands where one is coming from and with what power. If we don't begin to understand that, we will never be able to move forward on how we accommodate dissenting voices. And that some of those dissenting voices are actually dissenting voices which want to uphold prejudice, discrimination, class elitism, and so on. So these are very important, well, to me, these are very important issues that have to come forward when any debate takes place. It must be transparent and open on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to say that before ending the session, that everyone, all the panelists, can give 2 solutions. So you can start thinking about this, so that, by the end, so I will ask one by one what kind of solution you can propose for these topics. To each one of you, what if you are in charge, what would be 2 solutions you will think could help? So I will start with Marco. Marco? Can you hear me, Marco?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, so about solutions. Well, I don't know. I can talk. I can talk. Yeah, about solutions for this. I don't think I can give really solutions. I think that, as was said before, I mean, when we talk about transparency, it's important that there is a clear understanding of what we talk about. So with a good knowledge of also all the layers in history. So I think that it's very good to have as much education as possible on the history, and maybe, and this was my attempt in the chat, also see the perspective of the others when dealing with so difficult topics. That's the only thing I can maybe suggest. I mean, try to be as prepared as possible on history. So what happened all over the world in the past, and not to focus too much on what happened to you only, but to see if this happened already to somebody else. And of course, try to understand, I mean, the positions of all the positions of the people that are at stake. That's for me important in this specific case. But yeah, this is what I would limit, where I would limit my contribution, I think, because it's really much depending on case to case.
Thank you, Michael. So I will ask the same question to Prof. Said.
I think I've had my chance, and I've spoken far too much already. Thank you. If you could pass on to somebody else.
So I will ask to CPDI from Africa Global Studio.
Okay, so I'd say a couple of solutions, at least again, because of my, my world being in, excuse me, architectural heritage, seeing architecture as monuments. We may not have that many statues in Africa that remind us of what happened during the colonial era or slavery. We may not have that many. We do have lots of the slave castles that we have to contend with for those of us who navigate in those spaces. But I would say for architecture as monuments, we talk about intangible cultural heritage. It is not as if Africans do not still practice their culture, and that culture is what you translate into the built environment. That's how you create architecture. And so when you have people living in spaces that don't really reflect their culture, is borrowed, is Eurocentric, you are living in spaces that are very, very uncomfortable. You can't afford them, and so many other issues, and that's quite oppressive. And so for me, I would say solutions would be that as we decolonize our spaces in Africa, that we begin to bring those conversations back to the profession, to the academy, so that we can begin to build monuments in Africa that we occupy, but that truly reflect and preserve the story, preserve the true history, the true identity of the people. And then that is what they will interact with in their spaces. Because architecture truly is, every piece of architecture is a monument. And when you're navigating those spaces, again, from my background in architecture and how we preserve heritage in CPDI Africa, it's very important in so many ways. And so those would be my solutions, bringing that conversation of those intangible heritages back into the conversation, into the built environment, and creating proper monuments.
Thank you. So what about, So what about Deepak? What would be your contribution to solutions that will help?
I mean, I don't really like the word solutions because in a way it kind of fixes processes. And I think processes are kind of cyclical in the sense they're like a spiral that, you know, through dialogue, they need to keep progressing in some ways. I would like to just come back to the point that I had made at the webinar, which is, can we create spaces that are conversational versus only reclamatory? So it is not about a new narrative replacing the old, but it's really the space being designed in a way that multiple stories can be layered over what is being already told. And we do have that given the digital and the kind of media, you know, and the technology that we can access, or that is being overlaid on the museums to facilitate this participatory storytelling. But I think I would also like to go back to looking at using quote unquote tactile or human-based technologies, so to speak, into these spaces where, you know, whether it is performative or also in a way it supports livelihoods of communities that can get connected to the narrative that is being presented. Then maybe those space and contest it in that sense. So a way to talk back, a way to retell the story. That's one aspect of it. But I think I mean, I didn't make this point earlier, but I think the museum and the art gallery have a kind of a parallel colonial process of the, you know, the white cube, really, which kind of encases or, you know, creates value for objects, both produced by the artist and kind of fixed in a frame by the curator. And I think both these really need to be decolonized and to talk to each other. And in a way, like contemporary art processes are really not talking back much to processes that like this. And I feel museums cannot be looked at in isolation. And I think galleries and art practices also need to be critiqued simultaneously.
Thank you. So I will ask the same question to Dr. Ndoukaye. I hope he's back. Are you there? Because I think we lost him before.
Yes, I'm reconnected again.
Okay, welcome back. So I don't know if you heard the question previously. So I asked if you could propose at least 2 solutions that you think might change, I mean, the narrative.
You know, I'm not convinced at this moment that we could ever talk of solutions, you know, to this particular issue, because whatever we do, because we always begin from a presumption that we are searching for a democratic, you know, approach, and through that democratic approach, we will then come to a decision of what needs to happen. Are we putting monument A up, or we are taking monument B down? And I don't think it's as easy as that, because we need to accept that while democracy is considered to be a norm, I've never been convinced democracy exists anywhere, you know, in the world. And therefore, we should accept that whatever we do is not representative of the collective, and it should never be representative of the collective. We should accept that it is the dominant voice of any particular period that will always prevail. If we accept that principle, then I would say the first potential solution is that you know, what is supported by the majority at any given moment will be accepted as what will be done. So if the majority says roads must fall, physically, that it be, you know, but we should accept that you know, tomorrow a different and a dominating, you know, group of people will hold a contrasting, viewpoint. If we accept that, for me, then I do not see, a problem.
Thank you for your input. So as we can see, like some of them, thinks, we can bring some solution, and some, as you just said, like, it depends, how you think, and, if it's possible or not. So what about Paul Edwards? What do you think? Can you bring, do you think about 2 solutions that will be possible to change the narrative?
Sure. Well, I think one is, I guess, maybe an anti-solution, but I think we need to keep in mind that realistically, museums and academia are not going to save the day here. That these institutions are inherently colonial, and if they were to do any form of decolonization, they would stop being what they are. I say this very often, but if museums were to actually decolonize, they would not be museums anymore. So they would be something completely different. And I think that's preferable, honestly. And so kind of to ride on that, this solution realistically has to be about, we have to be open to changes, that we have to be willing and able to move away from these values of that we place behind certain sites like museums and galleries, that we have to be willing to accept these places can and probably should change in possible, like, in ways that we can't necessarily conceive of immediately, and certainly not in all of them change in the same way. So I think this really just comes back to we need to embrace incredible amounts of change, and that none of these things are supposed to last forever. As with, any kind of a monument, these receptacles of histories, because there are many histories, that these also cannot be the same thing forever. They themselves have to change and continue to change, or it just continues to make this vision of worlds that don't actually exist, and that might not help anybody. So I think that's more of an anti-solution than a solution.
Thank you. So let's go to Italy now with Dr. Elena. So what do you think? Would you be able to bring some contribution, having some solution?
As all the other panelists already said, I don't think there is a solution. And I think that it is impossible to find a consensus. And I think that consensus would be the death of the debate. So I think that it is good to keep the debate going on and to add more stories, more perspectives in the field. But I also think that we are focusing a lot on monuments, museums, but we are somehow forgetting another institution, which I think is really important, which is school. I think it would be necessary also to decolonize school curriculum. As I said before, here in Italy, we don't learn anything about our colonial past at school. So pretending to have a dialogue with people when people do not really access notion of stories, it's impossible. So I think we should work on a double level, school and then civil society, if you want to construct a powerful debate in the future as well.
Thank you, Elena. So
Sorry, can I just answer to Paul's question? Well, maybe decolonize is not the right, it's not the idea of state education. Oh, yes, but in the end, we have to find a way to teach people things. Otherwise, I mean, if thinking about the Italian history, if we don't tell children what happened in the past in school, which other place we can find, maybe school is not the ideal, maybe schools have many problems, but I think we should, I mean, we cannot just find negative aspects. We also have to work on the positive aspect of the instruments that we have. Otherwise, we are not going anywhere, I think.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask the same question to Lois, who has been very helpful helping us for the conference. So what do you think? Will you be able to have some solutions or not?
Oh my, I didn't anticipate talking in this.
Right.
I would very much, echo what has been said in terms of solutions, but also I think what Paul Edwards said previously, like these concepts of heritage and museums are inherently colonial, and so it goes a bit, I guess, between the conversation that just happened. Like, okay, we have certain tools that we can think of as problematic and change. At the same time, I think that the question of should we have these tools in the first place should be on the table to understand, to have the full range of conversation, let's say. If there are solutions, I don't think so. I don't think so. There are many ways we can address this. And I think my main point would be dialogue is important. Talking about these things is incredibly important. Engaging many people is important. But if it doesn't lead to material conditions improving for those who are oppressed, for those who are, let's say, minoritized, then there is no reason to talk. Then dialogue just becomes a way to kind of pretend we're dealing with something, but not really creating any actual change. So yeah, this for me, I think is the most important part.
Thank you so much. So what about Olivia? What do you think?
Again, just to echo what everyone said, I completely agree. I think for me, exactly as Dr. Lois just said, the kind of the idea of like historical justice has to be a path that's being traveled down alongside justice in a much more physical way in terms of material conditions. The two are interlinked in terms of, you can't question someone's physical response to being in a particular landscape, seeing a particular monument that will affect them. But at the same time, you can't expect that statue to be removed. So that the removal of such a statue or the recontextualization of a particular piece of architecture to fix structural inequalities in terms of employment or education or things like this. So they need to be happening at the same time. In terms of the kind of discussion that we've been having, just to build on Dr. Eleanor's point about education, for me, who's still very kind of tied to my time in education, I think there just needs to be a significant restructuring of the idea of history as something that should never just be assumed. It should be a constant question, a constant conversation, and it should be something that should be debated throughout someone's entire life and through a generation, their entire life of a generation. And that's in school. That's when you leave school, there should be more accessible ways of talking about your history and everyone being able to talk about their history, meaning making, not only making museums accessible, but what Dr. Paul said about this kind of museums not really being what museums are at the moment. Like they're not accessible spaces. and they're not necessarily always best equipped to actually teach people things. But yeah, allowing kind of the question of history to be a collective one, an accessible one, and one that can continue throughout someone's entire life, to account for generational changes in attitude, instead of being taught as history to be something of just remembering what's being taught to you, because that will always be a kind of dominant narrative that's given down. And of course, without the change in any material conditions, that voice will continue to be dominant no matter how much conversation happens. But my hope is that in my lifetime, I see material conditions change alongside this reform of the question of history being something that can continuously happen and adapt, to make sure that all people have the ability to speak on the question of their history in a collective.
Thank you, Olivia. So I will go now to Sophia. Sophia, what do you have to say about that? Do you think we can have some solutions, or?
Hi.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have two solutions. I think, first of all, we need, as academics, to recognize that we are part of an oppressive system. I think we've all discussed that. And that we are perpetuating that oppressive system. I think that's the first thing to recognize. And then we also, as academics and as gatekeeper, we have the responsibility, when we recognize that we are part of that oppressive system, to start changing it. And how to change that, I think that's kind of everyday little, a small size approach, with whether it's like, you know, to present, you know, diverse history. I don't know, we've been talking about Roman Empire, talking about, you know, I don't know, the Berbers, you know, that fought against and with, for instance, the Roman Empire. We don't talking about, you know, diversity of approaches within museums. I mean, I mentioned the Lampedusa Museum, for instance, where there's lots of work that have been done with migrants. So I think there's just a lot of little things that we can do on a smaller size, on a day-to-day basis. And of course, this great conference and our webinars are also a way forward. So yeah, so this is my two approach. First, to recognize that we as academics are part of the oppressive system, and second of all, to try to change that, because we have the power as academics to change the system, because we've been maintaining it. And so I think we have the power to change it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to go now to Paloma. So let's see what Paloma thinks about that. Any solutions?
Yes, hello. No, I completely agree with everyone else here. But also, I just want to address an important issue. We talk a lot about process, about conversations, but we are doing exactly what the state wants, non-action. And what we need to do is take action. And I believe the biggest problem here is that I don't like to use the term decolonizing. I have a lot of problems with that term. I would like to use the term anti-colonial. We need to get rid of our mental structures that are based on colonial roots. And the gatekeeping in academia doesn't help. And as Olivia said, we need to work more on synergies with civil society. And as many of you have addressed it, it's impossible to find some sort of democratic consensus, because there is no such thing at this point. We all know that. So I think the most important also is address the issues not only in museums or monuments or schools, but also we don't need to forget the issues of digital heritage. And there is a lot of discussions about GLAM and how this is being managed. Who owns that information? What are we discussing about custodianship, which is pretty much related to repatriation as well. So I think there is a lot of things that are hanging out there, and we need to be more proactive, take action, because there is a lot of discussions, but we need to put a more proactive issue, like, well, we start inviting people who, the stakeholders, and this is something that we wanted to address, that we are facing such a structural problems that we couldn't reach all the stakeholders for our webinars. It's very difficult to have people from the global south. It's very difficult to reach when there is a very big problem of structural inequalities as well. Not everyone has access to be in these webinars. Not everyone has the access to, to take a stand and make a point. And it's very important also to acknowledge that we are not just talking about or raising voices from other people. We need to be with them. We need to take them and be just one force, I guess. I think that's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Paloma. Very interesting point. So let's ask John, what does he think? John, are you there? Can you hear me? Okay, maybe some technical issue. So I will go to Surima. So what do you think you can bring on the table in terms of solution, if it's possible? Surima? I guess. John, Surima? Are you there? Oh, Surima, you need to unmute yourself. Bon. So I guess neither Surima and John can join us. So which one? So let's go to Tony. Tony, are you there?
Hi. Hello. Yeah. I mean, again, no solutions. Really interesting listening to what everyone else has been saying. It's kind of been triggering my own thoughts along the way. But certainly, me and Paloma have been discussing these structural issues. We're still working within a system where it's difficult to find people from communities, and we're gatekeepers. So there's definitely been some kind of discomfort in that, and it's working within the system as we have it. But it's also something else I've been thinking about is leading on to wider discussions about knowledge production and who has access to knowledge. And so alongside kind of like museums and art galleries, etc., we should also be thinking about archives, where archives are. There's huge portions of people's histories in Northern Europe, and I'm not sure that if there's much discussion about that. Certainly not in the mainstream, and I think this is a huge deal. I mean, you can potentially see why countries in Europe don't want the countries that they colonized have access to these materials. But I certainly think it's something that we should be absolutely discussing. As an academic from the UK, I was able to go to Belgium and access archives there, while the descendants of Congolese people whose stories are in the archives can't. And I think there's something very, very wrong with that. So just that's some of my thoughts, but yeah, obviously there's no solutions. Well, we can think about what we can do, but yeah.
Thank you. So it seems John is back. John, can you share your thoughts as well? Oh. Can you hear me, John? again, some technical issue. What about Suramya? Is she there or back? No? John, I can see you. Oh, he's trying to connect. So give him just a few minutes. Can you hear me, John? So it seems to know we have some technical issues to reach out to John. So I will end up with Dr. Toki Lautenbach to ask her the same question, and if she can give us her input in terms of solutions and share with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see everybody here, and it's amazing the discussions that have been going on. And okay, it's 6 or 7 in the morning for me here, but that's grand. My 2 solutions, really, I think everyone has sort of picked on, different aspects of this, but there are some issues that I still think haven't been addressed, which is borders. The scramble for Africa, borders. That in itself is a cultural landscape oppressive monument. And that has not been addressed. So do we open the borders in Africa? And we do it along ethnic lines, as opposed to having the same ethnic group in 2 different countries, speaking French or speaking English. And that alone has caused a lot of atrocities, which is currently upsetting Africa at the moment. And so if we're going to look at solutions, are we bringing business people to the table? Are we bringing politicians to the table? What are the ethical boundaries associated as them being stakeholders in this discourse? I'm not going to talk about decolonization because I have a big issue with the word. It means that we are talking in opposite terms of colonization, which is problematic. I'm talking about ethical values. Are we, as human beings or as stakeholders or as community participants or as custodians or as, again, gatekeepers, are we looking at the ethical implications of the decisions we make? So when we're making decisions, are we asking ourselves, are we socially responsible? Because when we begin to ask ourselves these questions, I think then it brings a lot of people into these discussions. When we begin to ask ourselves, are we representing everyone? Is everyone here without an agenda? Without a dominant voice that has an agenda? So are we opening the gates then? So in my opinion, if I was the boss, these are the questions I would ask myself as a boss, right? Am I being ethical? Am I being inclusive? What are the barriers? Are we looking at the barriers to accessibility? Are we opening that? What is stopping the community from being part of this narrative? And start to look in terms of social responsibility. Because without social responsibility, we're going to be having this topic or this discussion for the next 100 years. And we're not going anywhere by not being socially responsible. And I'm not just talking about human beings. I'm not talking about borders. I'm talking about biodiversity as well. And this is why we're having climate issues, because we're no longer in tune with the environment. And this is also important and should be part of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. It was very deep, and I would like to ask, to add that Dr. Toki Lautenbach is also the one who organized this conference, this very exciting conference, about this discussion that made it possible today. And thanks to you, to your effort and your input, and we truly appreciate it. And of course, so and what you just said, like truly needs to be more how to say, like, we can more discuss about it and to bring some suggestion, and now we can move forward with that. And finally, John is back. So we'll be able at least to share his thoughts as well. John, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, finally, you are back.
Yes, I'm back. I'm so sorry about earlier. So I'm having
live technical issues.
Exactly. I'm having some unstable internet, so I would please ask if I could keep my camera off. I think that would allow things to go a bit smoother.
Okay.
Okay,
So what do you think? I mean, in terms of solutions, so what do you think that could help?
Okay, so well, I guess everyone will probably, if you're aware of who I am and what I do, you probably know exactly what I think. So I'm a research assistant at the Center of Reparations Research at the University of West Indies in Jamaica. And I think that is like one of the biggest and most complex and most important initiatives for social justice that needs to occur for in situations like this when we're talking about monuments and oppression. I believe that we need to be putting our efforts towards redistributing all of the social and economic imbalances that came as a result of colonization and European imperial activity in the past 5 centuries. Everything that Dr. Toki has been talking about before, and some of the stuff that all the other panelists have been hinting at throughout this discussion, I think can be really wrapped up in this idea of reparations and reparative justice. Social inclusion, thinking about the environment, opening up borders, and also when it comes to addressing monuments and the politics of memory and whose memories actually get memorialized, whose stories actually gets to be told and handed down as a part of of a state narrative or a cultural narrative. And I think when we start with reparations, everything else will fall into place. And so that's kind of my idea and my position on everything.
Thank you. So now we're going to go to the next session, starting with the 20th, 21st century African architecture.
Okay, you ready for me?
Yes.
Okay, well, let me share my screen. So awesome to be here at our World Heritage Conference 2021. We're gonna just kind of dive into a quick conversation about contemporary architecture and heritage preservation. My name is Madly Okumabwa. I am the founder of CPDI Africa, and that stands for the Community Planning and Design Initiative Africa. We are all about preserving heritage and culture in the built environment. Let me just read quickly from our website, our vision. It'll paint the picture for what we're about to present today. Have you ever imagined what the architecture of Africa would look like today if the great civilizations of Egypt, Timbuktu, Mali, the Dogon, Zulu, Yoruba, and thousands of other African empires had continued to develop and evolve in their own unique identity? Imagine the transformation of the African landscape into sprawling metropolises filled with architectural masterpieces, celebrating new interpretations of traditional design elements, portrayed with all the comfort of modern technology. Now imagine once again that you have been given the opportunity to create these new design languages, drawing inspiration from Africa's glorious past, reflecting elements of her present identity, and then creating new languages so dynamic and innovative that it develops the foundation for the continent's emerging future. You, the creator and custodian of Africa's newly imagined environment. You, the architect of Africa's future. Now, talking about contemporary heritage and preservation, this image kind of depicts what we would probably call Afrofuturism, if those aesthetics and spirituality and the design philosophies that built the societies of Africa had continued to be developed, and if they were used today to build the continent. We see skyscrapers made out of Dogon masks and Zulu shields. We see the evidence of the sphinxes, the pyramids. This might depict the continent if indeed her heritage were preserved in modern forms. Or how about this image here by Jerry's, a game designer called Wakongo. He lives in Canada, but is originally from Congo. And in his game designing, he pulls upon the traditions and images from his home country. Are these images what we would expect if heritage and culture were preserved on the African continent? This image here is the National Museum of African American Culture and History. It's in the US, but it's pulling off of African aesthetic, sculpture, and identity. Is this Afrofuturism? This is the diaspora, and the diaspora is part of Africa. You can see that the image on the far left, the Yoruba totem pole, the corona on the statue's head, is the inspiration for the building. The same thing as we see in these West African geles, beautiful headdresses worn by the women, also providing inspiration for this building. The patterns and motifs are also pulled from the Gullah Geechee pattern work, which comes from West Africa. But what's the importance of creating new architectural languages that preserve identity in Africa and her diaspora? For that, we would have to look at the meaning of architecture. Well, architecture is defined as the art and science of building, constructing a building, but the extended definition is the reflection of the culture, lifestyle, aesthetics, local materials, climate, geography, political and economic purchasing power of a people in a place. So those are the elements, those intangibles that are translated into the built environment that creates architecture. For example, anywhere in the world, you look around you and you immediately know where you are just by what you see. The aesthetics of Japanese architecture, gingerbread houses of Holland, American red brick mansions, spiritual elements all on the facades of Indian buildings. Of course, the architecture of opulence in Dubai. These are the cultural and aesthetic elements. It's not just the aesthetics, you go behind these spaces, and the functionality also preserves or depicts culture. For example, Chinatown, anywhere in the world, you immediately begin to recognize. So for African architecture, what could that be? How is it possible that we can translate the identity of thousands of African ethnic groups into their built environment? So just like we saw on the previous image, you can be driving down the street in any space and immediately identify where you are. These two maps show the left, Africa as is today, is 54 countries with their colonial identities. The map on the right shows Africa, in fact, what it truly is. The black lines represent thousands of ethnic groups that have unique identities and design philosophies, spirituality, climates, their geographies, the materiality, unique. Some of them are similar, but most are very unique. The red lines superimposed are the country lines. And so when we're talking about heritage preservation, we're all very clear on what the architecture of antiquity is for Africa. What were the design briefs that created the pyramids? The stone as opposed to what we would see in other countries. We're very familiar with rural architecture, traditional aesthetics, very well defined. We can see in the materials that are used, this architecture is perfectly green. It has no impact on the climate, on the planet, on the people, totally biodegradable. But it's tradition and it's preserved in the rural environments. Well, what about our cities? We all know Africa's history. After being impacted by the Arabs, through Islam, through the Westerners, through Christianity. Our landscapes in Africa today, especially in the urban environment, reflect mostly our colonial heritage. We can see on the image on the very far right, the Hilton in Abuja, totally Western. Of course, the church and the mosque represent Christian and Islamic culture. The impact of colonization and the lack of African heritage preservation is shown very clearly in these images. Of course, the inner cities, we think of slums and neighborhoods in the periphery, people moving from the villages to the cities, not being able to afford. That is not the true culture of Africa. The McMansion on the far left and the ECOWAS building on the far right, using materials, glass and steel and cement that are part of the colonial history. These spaces do not necessarily identify with Africa, with their own culture. The other dichotomy is understanding that Africa has two identities, one in the rural and one in the urban. And so for our architecture, how would we differentiate between those spaces and what elements would we actually preserve? These conversations would have progressed if not for the fact that when African countries got their freedom in the 50s and 60s, our schools taught the Eurocentric curriculums, not allowing for true identity and culture in the architecture and other aspects of life to develop in Africa's identity. If they were to go back and pick back up from the last time that they were operating in their own original thought, what would they have designed and created? Well, my platform, CPD Africa, was launched in 2015, and it was to address the situation by bringing architects from around the world to engage with us in doing research on traditional design and coming up with prototypes, kits of parts that we could use to create new architecture that will preserve heritage and identity today and going forward. We launched competitions, but in order for our participants to respond to our challenge properly, we had to do a lot of teaching because, of course, in school, you do not learn African architecture. So in order for them to respond to my challenge to win the prizes and go down in history as being the developers of modern African architecture, I had to do a lot of teaching. Culture and lifestyle, aesthetics, spirituality, materials, and community engagement were the elements I taught to bring people up to speed. So for example, what do I mean by aesthetics? We can look at the ECOWAS building in Lomé, Togo, designed by Pierre Goudiaby Atepa, who drew inspiration from these elements on the far left. These African artifacts, or the Ghanaian Ashanti stools for the kings, the Egyptian headrests, these were seats of power. And when Goudiaby was designing, getting his design inspiration for his ECOWAS building, which was the seat of power for West African states presidents, he knew he was creating a seat of power as well. And so you can see how symbolically and aesthetically he drew inspiration from African culture, art, and aesthetics. Always, traditionally, it was women's jobs to include aesthetics on the buildings after they were built by the community. Here we see an Igbo woman painting uli patterns. We see some on a building. We see Ashanti Adinkra symbols. We also see Igbo insipidi. We see these patterns in the cloth, excuse me. And these aesthetics are very important. As I said, the first thing you see when you see a building is what you see and what does it tell you. If you're familiar with the symbols and patterns of that community, you will have an idea where you are. Excuse me. We also pulled collages of other cultural heritage in order to have the architects have proper resources to create their designs for sending in. We drew evolutionary collages like this one here. We see in the top right, the image of a very traditional Igbo Mbari house, which is a worship center. And we see how it goes through the Edo version, which these Igbo and Edo people are actually the same people. They blended. And then we see the work of Dimas Wonko, who is an Igbo architect from Delta State, and we see his translation of this Igbo and Edo architecture into his home. A very perfect example of heritage preservation. We talked of culture and spirituality. For example, in the Francis Carey building, where designing this school for his village, he had to leave open classroom spaces because the village believed, and still believe, that the ancestors must be present when children are learning. So all of the classrooms could not be enclosed with doors and windows, because that would mean that you were keeping out the ancestors. But these courtyard spaces meant that whenever the students were in these spaces, the ancestors will have access to them. This is intangible culture, but this is how you translate it into the architecture of a people. Also, another example, this one from Nigeria, the previous was from Burkina Faso. In this family home, in Igbo land in the eastern part of Nigeria, we believe in burying our ancestors in our homes. This is actually my family home, and my grandfather and great-grandfather are buried here. This is because we believe that the cycle of life is never broken. So it is, any human being is at some point in their lives on that cycle. It's either you're coming, you're here, or you're leaving. And so having your loved ones right there to still communicate with them, to feed them, to pour libations, is part of the intangible cultures that is preserved in this building, and is still preserved in buildings that are designed all around in this community. Talked about materials. Materials are very important because they also embed culture. On the very far left, we see clay, traditional, and on the far right, we see contemporary. That's rammed earth. Traditional buildings, contemporary prototypes for the rural areas. And then I will jump right into a few examples that came out of our competition. Talking about heritage preservation, this young architect who won our 2015 competition used rammed earth and said in her research, she was finding a lot of solutions to contemporary challenges that were being faced in Vietnam that Africans had solved thousands of years ago and had forgotten because their heritage was not being documented and preserved. Packaging that for her own city's planning and policymakers. This is the kind of research that came out in our competitions. And our goal was, again, to find ways to preserve the story in the built environment. This Russian architect did a design called the mask. She drew inspiration from several masks. You can see her design was actually a work of art. She pulled on the spirituality embedded in the masks. And of course, she used organic materials, stone, wood, lots of clay, and she also did use some cement. This is the mask. The Iton, which was a winning design in our 2017, inspired by the calabash and all of the meaning embedded in it. It was a live, work, play space. You can definitely see aesthetically and organically that is an African precedent. The Ifa house, drawing on Yoruba palatial designs, the columns from Yoruba palaces were used to hold up his ceiling in the courtyard in his house. Again, rammed earth, pulling on the images from Burkina Faso. The story continues. And that was the whole point of our design competition, was to show that it was possible to translate traditional architecture in a contemporary way and preserve a story that was still valuable, as opposed to only importing ideas, aesthetics, importing materials and ways of life from outside that did not necessarily work and was very unaffordable for those on the continent. We were showing that it could be done. Fusion Point also included inspiration from Northern Nigeria and Northern Africa. She used local materials. This design from Ethiopia, you can see the inspiration on the bottom right, a favorite with artists. We also did African diaspora architecture. This young designer is from Haiti. Ikechukwu is Igbo from Nigeria. Jarawa architecture, more Igbo architecture, Yoruba design. And these designs came in from our designers in the cohort from 2020. These masterpieces would compare, I would say, to the pyramids. We do art exhibitions to showcase our work and to let our clients know that it is very possible to translate their culture into their own projects. We also use this information for students and teachers who want to understand how to bring this to the academy. We have documented a lot of our work on our website at cpdafrica.org. A lot of our work can be downloaded and read in detail. It's also used in a lot of schools. We still run competitions. This year, we just launched a new one, the African Heritage Architecture Competition, where all ethnic groups are encouraged to submit designs that preserve their culture story. So we begin to capture ethnic group by ethnic group before this information is lost forever. Also this year, we launched our Global Studio for African-Centered Architecture, built on design philosophies by Dimas Wonko and David Hughes, a new culture and Afrocentric architecture. Our courses are 6 weeks long, and students and professionals are welcome to our courses. They're all online. And what we pride ourselves by is that it is the one space where students who are looking for content for their courses in school, they will now have access to that. Professors who are looking for a body of knowledge to use in teaching students all over the world about Africa's contributions to the built environment, they have a space to gain that knowledge. Professionals seeking to use to incorporate African culture and preserve our story in the built environment have a place now to gather that information. And of course, for policymakers, we have that information available. So at www.cpdafrica.org, we would like to invite you to that space to see more of what we do and see how we are encouraging the generation to come how to preserve this story in Africa's contributions to the built environment. I hope that this adds tons of value to our conference today. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Madidi from CPDI Africa.